Hello and welcome. This is a regulatory panel on cultivated meat's path to market. I'm Jessica Almy, the Vice President of Policy at the Good Food Institute, and I am delighted that you're joining us today for this panel. 5 years ago, the kinds of things we're going to be talking about today were things that law professors debated in classrooms. But it's no longer academia and the ivory tower. The things we're going to talk about today are real. And just like Amy Chen said in this morning's plenary, that cultivated meat has gone from an idea of kind of science fiction even 5 years ago for many of us. So too, the regulatory issues have gone from academia to real issues that companies need to navigate as they think about bringing their products to market. Nothing is more important than for cultivated meat to be safe and properly labeled. That is paramount. But it is also important that there not be red tape in bringing these products to market if we're going to feed 10 billion people by 2050 without exceeding our planetary boundaries. The Good Food Institute has policy advocates around the world who provide independent advocacy to usher in a better future of food. Our US-based team is in Washington, D.C., where I join you today, but we have colleagues in Europe, Asia, Israel, Brazil, around the world who are working to ensure a fair path to market for cultivated meat and other novel ingredients. And the policy is being made now. This is an incredibly exciting time in the history of these issues. And if you're inspired by our conversation today, I hope you'll think about joining us. In the United States, the policy team is hiring a paralegal based in Washington, D.C., and we'll have some more policy positions up soon. In Europe, our team is hiring a policy manager. In Asia, we're hiring a policy specialist. And these opportunities are available on gfi.org/careers and gfi.org/vocation. So today, I am delighted to be joined by colleagues outside of the Good Food Institute who work in government and private practice. We're all united in working together for a secure, sustainable, and just food system. And we've got a fantastic program for you today. So I will share the agenda now. Fantastic. And so the agenda is coming up. Now you'll see this is kind of the welcome. We ask you to be respectful in the chat. This has been a fantastic forum in other panels, and I know you'll continue to make it a great one today. First, we're going to hear from the United States Department of Agriculture. We have Jamie Woodside joining us, who will give that perspective. Afterwards, that will be followed by Dipti Kulkarni's food attorney's perspective on these issues. And third will be the Singapore Food Agency's perspective presented by Tang Yong Lo. And then we will have a brief panel discussion. So I'm really looking forward to it. First up is Jamie. Jamie Woodside is a program analyst in the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, FSIS, in the Office of International Coordination. She's been with FSIS for over 11 years in various roles ranging from regulatory enforcement, recalls, international equivalence, and outreach and education. Jamie's assisting with the policy development for the equivalence of international food safety inspection systems overseeing cultivated livestock and poultry meats produced for export to the United States. She's based out of Hartford, Connecticut, and holds academic degrees in, get this, animal science, public health, and law from the University of Connecticut. And she wants me to say, go Huskies. So with that, I will pass it along to Jamie.
Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. And thank you to the Good Food Institute for inviting me to participate on today's panel. I would like to take a few minutes to share a brief, really high-level overview of the roles and responsibilities that both the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, and I will be referring to it as FSIS throughout this presentation, will take on in overseeing foods comprised of or containing cultured animal cells to ensure that they are safe and properly labeled. Next slide. The information I am describing today is primarily drawn from the March 2019 formal agreement between FDA and USDA regarding the oversight of human food produced using animal cell technology derived from cell lines of USDA amenable species. A link to this agreement is provided at the end of my presentation today. The key points are that oversight will depend on what species the cells are from and whether they are being used for human or animal food. FDA and FSIS will divide responsibility for oversight of human foods incorporating cultured animal cells derived from livestock, such as cattle, swine, sheep, goats, and Saluriformes fish, and poultry, which are chickens, turkeys, ducks, geese, guineas, ratites, and squab. FDA will provide oversight for human foods incorporating cultured animal cells derived from fish and seafood, again, excluding Saluriformes fish. And FDA will provide oversight for animal foods regardless of the source of the animal cells. Next slide. So I'm going to provide a high-level overview of the FDA roles and responsibilities. I'm obviously not FDA. But FDA's authority to regulate these products is derived from the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This act gives FDA the responsibility to ensure that foods and food ingredients are safe, that they are labeled in ways that are truthful and not misleading. The act gives FDA many tools to support their mission, and one key tool is the concept of adulteration. If a food is adulterated under the act, it is illegal and it is subject to FDA enforcement action. There are many ways a food can be adulterated. For example, a food is adulterated if it contains unsafe food ingredients, or if it's made under conditions where it could become contaminated and render the food injurious to health. Next slide. FDA implements its statutory responsibilities for cultured animal cell food and feed products using 4 key processes. The first is to conduct pre-market consultations with individual firms on their production processes and products. This applies to cells from all species intended for human food use. This process is described in the 2019 formal agreement. The consultations will include evaluations of the inputs to the cell culture production process, which includes cell lines and other materials used. The consultations will also evaluate the production processes themselves, including material produced and the manufacturing controls put in place to ensure a safe and consistent product. FDA will be engaging with FSIS during these consultations and sharing results with FSIS. The FDA encourages firms who are seeking to produce these products to begin consultations with them early in the product development phase. The second key process, is to conduct oversight of post-market activities related to cell culture. And this includes collection of cells from animals, development and maintenance of cell banks, and culture of cells. This includes working with FSIS, as FDA hands off oversight during the harvest stage for livestock and poultry cells. Cell harvest is an important step in which the cultured cells are removed from the controlled and sterile environment and are no longer maintained in a living state. And I'll further refer this to as a controlled exit from viability, and I'll mention this again later in this presentation. Cell harvest is going to be subject to conventional food process. After cell harvest, these products will be subject to conventional food processing methods. Of course, FDA will be working with FSIS closely and will share information from these processes as appropriate to facilitate FSIS roles and responsibilities. The third key process is to conduct post-market oversight of food products comprised of or containing cultured fish or seafood cells during conventional food processing, packaging, and marketing. And that includes labeling for these products. So as I indicated before, fish or seafood products are subject to FDA jurisdiction, not FSIS oversight. Finally, the fourth process is to conduct pre-market and post-market oversight of feed products comprised of or containing cultured animal cells. This is overseen by the FDA Center for Veterinary Medicine, or CVM, and they will be overseeing all uses of cultured animal cells for animal feed, including ingredients added to the feed and pet food. It will be consistent with CVM's current oversight structure. All requirements that apply to any FDA-regulated entity or facility will apply to animal cell culture firms and facilities. And this includes facility registration requirements, current good manufacturing practice and preventative controls, and requirements applicable to food ingredients, substances that can become a component of food or otherwise affect food characteristics. FDA will be conducting inspections and related oversight activities for all cell bank and cell culture facilities in accordance with their current agency processes for domestic and foreign facilities. FDA will take enforcement action as needed to ensure these facilities and their products comply with FDA laws and regulations. And as before mentioned, and will be a repetitive theme throughout this presentation, the FDA will work closely with FSIS on jointly regulated products. And again, these are the products comprised of livestock and poultry cells to ensure that these products entering the US marketplace are safe and properly labeled. Next slide. Now I'll go over the USDA FSIS responsibilities. This slide depicts the mission of the Food Safety and Inspection Service, and that is to ensure that meat, poultry, and egg products are safe, properly labeled, and packaged. Next slide. FSIS's authority to regulate meat and poultry product safety and labeling is derived from the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Poultry Products Inspection Act. The acts have definitions of meat and poultry product adulteration and misbranding that are very similar and in many ways identical to those from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, of which the FDA has oversight. FSIS statutory authorities differ from FDA's, however, in several ways that will be pertinent to the regulation of food products made from cultured cells of livestock and or poultry. First, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and Poultry Products Inspection Act direct the USDA to inspect the production of all meat and poultry products during slaughter and processing. Second, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and Poultry Products Inspection Act require USDA to pre-approve meat and poultry product labels. And third, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and Poultry Products Inspection Act both require imported meat and poultry products to be produced under foreign inspection systems that achieve an equivalent level of safety as is achieved by the US inspection system, and that these products be re-inspected prior to entry into the United States. All these statutory requirements will apply to food products that incorporate cultured cells from livestock and poultry, except obviously for the slaughter inspection portion. Next slide. So I'll try to give more of a high-level overview, and I know that time is of the essence, but FSIS will require inspection in all establishments that harvest and or process cultured livestock and poultry cells for use in human food. Although some FSIS inspection methods may be customized to address the unique aspects of cell culture technology, much of the FSIS inspection in cell cultured food establishments will be similar or identical to inspection in traditional meat and poultry processing establishments. Therefore, with the exception of labeling, FSIS does not anticipate creating new regulations for cell-cultured meat and poultry products. As such, cell-cultured food establishments under FSIS jurisdiction will have to meet the same regulatory requirements that traditional meat and poultry processors must meet, and that includes the sanitation and HACCP requirements. Each establishment that harvests and or processes cells from livestock or poultry is required by law to obtain a grant of inspection from FSIS. And requirements for obtaining that grant of inspection include development of sanitation standard operating procedures also known as sanitation SOPs or SSOPs, completion of the hazard analysis, and the development and validation of a HACCP plan for each category of processing that it undertakes. Finally, there is a requirement for the development of written recall procedures. The FSIS inspection of cell harvest and processing will occur at a frequency of at least once per shift. The inspection frequency that is also required for processing traditional meat and poultry products. This level of verification is necessary for products to receive the USDA mark of inspection. FSIS inspectors will verify compliance with all applicable regulatory requirements, including HACCP and sanitation again. And additionally, as with other meat and poultry products and their labels, the labels of products made from cultured cells of livestock and poultry will require pre-approval by FSIS, and the accuracy of those labels will be verified on-site by USDA inspectors. All products that are inspected and passed by FSIS must carry the mark of inspection. Next slide. FSIS will coordinate with FDA on the transfer of regulatory jurisdiction at cell harvest. And the key to the transfer of jurisdiction is the transfer of information. Again, I just want to say harvest of the cell cultured livestock, meat and poultry products is defined as the controlled exit from viability. This transfer of information will ensure that the information relevant to product safety is shared and will hopefully eliminate duplication of requirements on industry, as well as duplication of work by the two agencies. FSIS will take enforcement action as appropriate to ensure that only safe, wholesome, and properly labeled products enter commerce. And, as just mentioned, will exchange information with FDA to ensure that the cell-cultured food operations under their jurisdiction are producing safe products. The policies governing international equivalents of cell-cultured meat and poultry are still under development. Countries that are wishing to become eligible to export cell-cultured meat and poultry products to the United States must demonstrate that they have a regulatory food safety system that is equivalent to that of the United States. Like imports of traditionally produced meat and poultry products, imports of meat and poultry products made from cultured cells of livestock and poultry must originate from eligible countries and from establishments or plants that are certified to export to the United States. It is also important to note that the imports of these products will also be subject to applicable requirements of the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, and those of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Next slide. And then I'll quickly go over, again, the joint responsibilities of FDA and USDA. So as you've probably noticed by now, a recurring theme of this presentation is that FDA and FSIS will be working together on the oversight of these new food production technologies, as we already do in many areas of food safety, both at headquarters and in the field. In particular, we'll be developing a detailed framework for shared oversight at harvest so that handoff is efficient and provides the necessary information. Most importantly, both agencies will be sharing information to ensure cell-based products comprising meat and poultry are safe, unadulterated, and properly labeled. We'll be developing coordinated principles for product labeling and claims to ensure a coherent approach across products made with animal cell culture technology. And regarding the labeling of cell-cultured livestock and poultry products, FSIS has recently published an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to solicit input from the public. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that comments are due by November 2nd, 2021. Next slide. So in the view of both FDA and FSIS and USDA, both regulators and regulated industry benefit from engagement with federal regulators early and often. The agencies benefit from a more detailed, informed view of the range of technical implementations of this new food production technology, which will enhance our ability to provide effective and efficient oversight. Firms will benefit from a better understanding of the regulatory expectations and requirements. This allows them to make informed decisions about technical and market strategies in this rapidly evolving sector of the food industry. And so this slide, I want to just emphasize that any firm that's interested in producing products for the US market can and should reach out to the FDA contacts that are listed on this slide, as well as FSIS, to begin discussions at any time. Next slide. And finally, I just want to provide additional resources that are specific to animal cell culture technology from both FDA and FSIS. And I would like to thank you all for listening to this presentation today. So the next slide contains additional resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Many members of the audience are thanking you for this really informative presentation. We really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you and the honor of having USDA's FSIS present at our conference. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dipti Kulkarni. She is a law partner at Sidley Austin, where she counsels clients on a wide range of FDA and USDA regulatory issues, including issues related to the use of novel and emerging technologies to develop foods and animal products. Before joining Sidley, Dipti was an associate chief counsel in the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel, where she advised policymakers on similar issues, as well as cross-product matters, including imports and exports, interagency jurisdiction, and constitutional issues. Dipti, we're delighted to have you at the conference today.
Thank you, Jessica, for that introduction, and to the Good Food Institute for inviting me today. I am delighted to join this panel and conference. As Jessica mentioned at the outset, 5 years ago, since there's been a lot of debate and discussion about regulatory oversight of these products, and a lot of progress has been made in reaching a framework, as Jamie walked us through just now, which is really exciting. And as part of my presentation, as a follow-up to that really helpful overview that Jamie provided, I will provide a food attorney's perspective with a focus on practical pointers relating to joint oversight by FDA and FSIS, including what is regulated by whom and how, and what is the current process as we know today, and what comes next, building on that very helpful overview that Jamie just provided. Next slide, please. So before diving in, I'd like to take a step back and address a very important threshold question, which is, why does the regulatory framework matter? Why does it matter what the process is, what the data and information are that are considered, and who does what? Well, there are at least two reasons that are worth mentioning in response to that question. And the first is that a regulatory framework based on science, facts, and the law helps inform the public on whether to trust the technology and the food that is produced from it, as well as any claims made about the product. And as Jessica noted at the outset, that requires balance. If there were no regulatory requirements, consumers would not have a way to trust or understand the food that is being made, how it's being made, and whether it's safe and appropriately labeled. If the regulatory requirements were not based on science, risk, good law, or were overly burdensome or administered arbitrarily, innovators and investors may not be incentivized to comply or compete in that field. Agencies also must prioritize limited resources by adopting risk-based and otherwise appropriate policies to implement laws and ultimately protect consumers. And second, whenever there are new technologies relating to food development and production, we are often tasked with revisiting how food is regulated in the US, by whom and why. And this is because many of the jurisdictional lines that govern our modern food system today were drawn nearly a century ago. And as you can imagine, these lines were set in place well before Congress, legal scholars, and scientists could even fathom the technology being contemplated today. As such, these new technologies often challenge pre-existing regulatory frameworks, which were not exactly designed to address these products. Thus, as is often the case, regulatory agencies, informed by facts and science and the law, input from industry and other stakeholders, are tasked with determining and explaining how these foods will be regulated, and then implementing and calibrating that regulatory system moving forward. So this is why you get the headlines like the ones you see here, and why the regulatory framework is such a critical piece of this fascinating puzzle. And while the landscape continues to evolve, there are several questions we can answer today and key pointers to walk away with, building off of that excellent overview that Jamie just provided. Next slide, please. So just a brief recap on who will do what. We won't spend too much time on this since we got that really helpful overview from Jamie. But to recap, in March 2019, FDA and FSIS issued the formal agreement that Jamie walked us through, outlining how they will have joint oversight of food derived from cell lines of USDA amenable species, so the animals that Jamie identified, as well as how they will regulate, at least at a high level, the labeling of such products. So under that framework, FDA will conduct pre-market consultations to evaluate production materials and processes and manufacturing controls relating to cell collection, banking, and all components and inputs. The agency will oversee initial cell collection and development and maintenance of qualified cell banks, and the proliferation and differentiation of cells through the time of harvest, which Jamie just explained, I think, in a really precise way, the controlled exit from viability, which is a helpful marker. FDA also will conduct pre-harvest inspections and related activities under its Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act authorities as amended by the Food Safety and Modernization Act, FSMA. Oversight will transfer from FDA to FSIS at harvest, as we've heard, and thereafter FSIS will oversee post-harvest inspection and product labeling, with pre-approval labeling authority verified through inspection. And as Jamie noted, finished product will need to bear USDA mark of inspection. FDA will retain primary oversight over foods derived from fish, seafood cells, except of course for catfish. And both agencies will share and coordinate at various stages. So based upon that recap, let's unpack what will be regulated, by whom and how. So next slide, please. So we'll break that down even further with some practical pointers to leave here with. So as part of the pre-market consultation process, looking carefully at the formal agreement, thinking about FDA's pre-market oversight and adulteration authorities, as Jamie mentioned, FDA will evaluate substances used in manufacturing, including animal cells, media components, and scaffolding, and assess manufacturing processes and controls, including whether there is an impact on identity, composition, nutrition, and safety. For processes occurring before harvest, FDA will conduct inspections under FSMA and its other authorities under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, evaluating food safety plans, preventative control measures, as well as compliance with current good manufacturing process, otherwise known as GMP. For post-harvest processes, beginning with labeling, FDA will regulate labeling for seafood products, except for catfish, under the misbranding provisions of the FDCA. So that means, among other things, an appropriate product name, ingredient labeling, nutrition labeling, if mandatory, and any voluntary claims being made about the product. For meat and poultry products, FSIS will regulate labeling under provisions of its statutes, as Jamie mentioned, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, FMIA, and the Poultry Product Inspection Act, the PPIA. This includes mandatory pre-approval of labels, so different from FDA's labeling process. And review will include, among other things, appropriate product name, ingredient labeling and nutrition labeling if applicable, and any voluntary claims. In addition, for post-harvest processes for meat and poultry, FSIS will inspect on a patrol basis to assure safety, including evaluation of HACCP plans, SSOP, and verification of labeling. For seafood, again, other than catfish, FDA will have oversight under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, including its pre-existing seafood HACCP requirements. It is expected that FSIS will review batch records during cell culturing and verify compliance with applicable FSIS regulatory requirements during product processing, packaging, and labeling. Next slide, please. So, what does that mean in terms of process? Well, it means a few things, at least right now. So in terms of the pre-market consultation process, that begins, whether you're dealing with meat or poultry or seafood, with FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, CFSAN. That entails an in-depth evaluation of production materials, processes, and manufacturing controls, where there is an engagement process with agency scientists to evaluate such information. This includes an assessment of cell lines, cell banking, all components and inputs. It's conducted pursuant to FDA's Food Additive and Other Adulteration Authorities under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And importantly, FDA intends to publish completed consultations on its website. Moving to the inspection process governed by FSIS, that involves, as Jamie mentioned, an application of the other pre-existing authorities that apply, including application for grant of inspection, going through that application process, developing written SSOPs, conducting a hazard analysis, and developing and validating a HACCP plan, information that's submitted as part of your grant of inspection. And this is pursuant to FMIA and PPIA authorities and implementing regulations. Moving to the label approval, again, under FSIS authorities, that is slated to follow the same application process that currently applies to pre-existing products, where a label is submitted through the approval system. The review is conducted by FSIS's labeling and program delivery staff, LPDS. There's no generic approval at this time. What that means is that all cultivated or cell cultured product labels are subject to review. And again, this is pursuant to FMIA and PPIA authorities and implementing regulations. Importantly, the agencies have indicated that while rulemaking processes, particularly on the FSIS side, may be ongoing, that should not preclude FSIS from being able to review individual product labels for products developed using cell culture technology. So what comes next? Let's move to the next slide. As Jamie noted and has been indicated previously, agencies, FSIS and FDA, have established working groups to clarify processes and develop further details. For the pre-market assessment, that working group is led by FDA. The focus there is clarifying the process FDA will use for pre-market consultations. There's a labeling working group that's led by FSIS with a focus on developing joint principles for labeling and claims. There's a transfer of jurisdiction working group co-led by both agencies with the goal of developing procedures for transfer and inspection at harvest. Within that context, FDA intends to issue guidance on pre-market consultations that should provide greater detail on the information that's to be submitted to CFSAN as part of that process and the process itself. This should go through FDA's good guidance procedures, which means that it should be subject to a comment process. So there's an issuance of a draft guidance, a comment process, and then a final guidance. As part of that process, it will be important for industry and stakeholders to provide comment. Labeling, of course, remains a closely watched issue. FDA and USDA have said that they will develop joint labeling principles for product labeling and claims to ensure consistency and transparency. FDA published a request for information in October on the labeling of foods comprised of or containing cultured seafood cells. That comment period closed earlier this year in March 2021. Approximately 40 substantive comments were received. FSIS published an ANPR, as Jamie mentioned, which is an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, earlier this month on the labeling of meat and poultry products comprised of or containing cells derived from animals. That comment process, a comment period closes on November 2nd, unless extended. And it seeks comment on issues similar to those raised by FDA, including appropriate product names, other disclosures, consumer understanding of such terms, and other terms that are currently used for food products, how to assess material differences between foods produced using cultivated or cultured meat or poultry cells and conventionally produced foods. And in addition, FSIS has also asked for comments on whether it should issue new standards of identity for cultivated meat and poultry and related benefits and costs to industry. It's also asked questions about whether it should amend its pre-existing regulations to specifically include or exclude such foods. This is something that it has done in the past with respect to other technologies. And it's asked for input with respect to what claims are likely to be used in the labeling of such products and whether FSIS should develop new regulations or guidance to ensure that such claims are truthful and not misleading. So a lot of really fascinating and important developments since the last time this conference was convened. And I'm looking forward to discussing these issues further with the panelists during the discussion session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dipti. That additional clarity is really helpful when we think about why regulation matters and where we are today relative to last time we all got together. Our final speaker is Mr. Tang-Young Lau. He's a branch head at the Risk Assessment and Communications Department of the Singapore Food Agency's National Center for Food Science. He is responsible for the development of the regulatory framework for novel foods and has been involved in the safety assessment of new food ingredients such as fermented or microbial proteins and cultivated meat. We're delighted to have Singapore at this conference today because this is the one place in the world where cultivated meat already has regulatory approval. So Tang-Young, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for the kind introduction, and thank you to GFI for having the Singapore Food Agency being present today. All right, may I have the next slide, please? Right, so first of all, just a very quick introduction on the Singapore Food Agency. We are relatively new, so I tend to always introduce ourselves. We were formed only just in April 2019 with the mission of ensuring and securing a supply of safe food. And one interesting thing about the Singapore Food Agency is that through our formation, we had consolidated all food-related government functions. So we have actually oversight over the entire food supply chain. And in doing so, we can strengthen Singapore's food safety and food supply. All right, next slide, please. So I tend to start with a slide on helping everyone to consolidate on their thinking about alternative proteins. But seeing that this is a GFI conference, I don't think I need to go into the details too much. But what I usually want to focus on is the fact that the alternative proteins as a category contains a very vast variety of various different proteins. And this could be things like plant-based proteins, fermentation proteins, insect proteins, or cultured meat, or over here we call it cultivated meat, right? And next slide, please. So in Singapore, some alternative proteins could be novel foods, and our approach to novel foods is based on whether or not these foods have a history of use for human consumption. And we take 20 years as a basis for considering history of use. We also include compounds that are chemically identical to naturally occurring substances but produced through advances in technology. So when we apply this thinking into alternative proteins, we quickly see that some alternative proteins are unlikely to be novel foods. And these include proteins such as those that are derived from plants that have been used for culinary purposes for a long time. But at the same time, we also have some alternative proteins that will be regulated as novel foods. So, for example, we would consider cultivated meat or seafood, as well as products produced through acellular agriculture to be novel. So, some examples of what we have previously assessed and allowed are, include cultured chicken cells, as well as beta-lactoglobulin from the company Perfect Day, right? Can I have the next slide, please? Right. So for alternative proteins that do not have a history of consumption as food, SFA requires that these undergo a pre-market safety assessment process. So what this means is that companies are required to produce a safety assessment on their novel foods, which are then reviewed by SFA. And if all things are clear, these novel foods are then allowed for sale on the market. We have published a guidance document on the information that is required for SFA safety, for the safety assessment. And we actually also encourage companies to come to consult and engage with SFA very early in their process. So sometimes as early as while they are still at R&D. And this is because companies are often doing really different things, and what we recognize that what we have may not be able to cover what they are doing. So more information about our requirements is of course available on our website, and I've included a link that's available on this QR code. Right. Next slide, please. Right. So, of course, the main purpose of having the safety assessment is to characterize the novel food in as much detail as possible so as to identify potential food safety risks. And companies are expected to do this by describing their product, including information on the materials input, ingoing materials used, as well as describing their manufacturing processes and studying the effects that these may have to health, as well as describing how their potential risks will be managed with substantiating data to demonstrate effectiveness. SFA's role in this is to carry out a comprehensive and thorough review of the company's safety assessments to ascertain that potential food safety issues have been addressed. And we do this by going through each of the process and each input to identify the possible food safety hazards, as well as looking for published scientific literature that may contradict the information submitted and find out whether this in fact affects the safety of the product. And through this, we evaluate the steps taken by companies to manage potential risks to see if they are reasonable and effective. We also consider the health impact of novel foods when consumed as intended by conducting estimations on dietary exposure and evaluating the impact. This is because the risks from foods are dependent on both the toxicity of the substance as well as the amount consumed. All right, next slide, please. So in addition to SFA's reviews of companies' safety assessments, we have also established an expert working group on novel foods to help provide scientific advice and ensure that assessments are rigorously reviewed and evaluated. So the current chair of our expert working group is Professor John Lim, who heads the core or Center for Regulatory Excellence at the Duke NUS Medical School. Next slide, please. Right. So as with any other food, alternative proteins are also required to comply with all of the chemical, microbiological, and labeling requirements that are set out under Singapore food regulations. So in brief, our Singapore food regulations, like the requirements for many countries, cover things like chemical requirements, including the use of food additives, setting out limits for maximum levels for contaminants, as well as microbiological standards, as well as labeling requirements. Perhaps one interesting element for labeling is that for alternative proteins, we have established a position where alternative proteins should include a qualifying term so as to differentiate them from a typical animal or meat product. And this is actually something that, taken into the context of food in Singapore, has been happening for a long time. So, for example, in Singapore, you would very readily find on the market, even about 5 or 10 years ago, products that are termed as, say, mock chicken or mock duck and so on. And these are typically plant-based products are made of perhaps wheat or soy proteins. And we see that this use of qualifying term as a continuation of this traditional use of plant-based proteins. And we think that consumers are also familiar with the use of such terms. All right, next slide, please. So SFA really recognizes that the opportunities and benefits offered by alternative proteins can be applied to any country. And we have been very keen to engage with our regulatory counterparts internationally to jointly discuss the regulatory approach to novel foods. We hope to raise awareness and help regulators align requirements. So we have been doing this through platforms such as on the screen, you see this Regulators Forum on Novel Foods, which we conducted in November 2019, where we had the privilege of having Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, as well as the China CFSA, to share on their own approaches for regulations of novel foods. We are planning a second edition of this Regulators Forum in November this year. We are also seeking opportunities with regulators to formalize relationships such as through MOUs to pave the way for deeper collaboration, and are also keen to explore multilateral platforms for further collaboration in this area. All right, next slide, please. So with that, I've come to the end of the very brief presentation. I've left an email address where any companies who are here who would like to have an early engagement with Singapore can reach out to us. All right, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Teng Yong. I would like to spend a few minutes to bring all of the presenters up to the stage and ask you just a few questions. We covered so much ground in this session, and there are so many questions bubbling up in my mind. But I think the first one I want to ask is for you, Teng Yong. If an international firm wants to sell cultivated meat in Singapore, can you give us a sense of how long the process might take?
Yes, that is always the question that I get, but unfortunately it's one that's really difficult to answer. And hence, through all of our communications, we have always been telling companies to engage with us really early and so on.
Early.
Just to give you a gauge, we have looked at and evaluated and approved novel ingredients in as short as about 3 to 6 months. But at the same time, for cultivated meat, I think it's a more of a new area. So it's it can take as long as about 2 years. So we are internally trying to streamline things and to help make it smoother for companies, looking at about a ballpark of about 1 year, using a stop the clock approach, of course. Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you. And how much does it cost?
We don't charge any fees at all. So come talk to us,
All right. So companies who are here, go talk to them. And Teng Yong, you say that I know that the Singapore Food Agency is open to international collaboration. What's the most important lesson you share with other regulators, and what do you hope to learn from them in those conversations?
Right. So the Singapore Food Agency is really new in the area of novel foods. So personally, I started looking and picking it up about in 2018. And at events such as this, we always say that we are still learning from everybody. Yeah, and that's our approach. But in the short time that we have been doing this, we found that the early engagement process has been really helpful, not only for ourselves, but also for the companies, because the companies sometimes also are able to discover more information. They may discover that they may have certain gaps in their thinking at that point of time through their discussions with us. And of course, for SFA, from our perspective, it really helps us better understand what the industry is trying to do, where are they heading towards, so that we can start getting ourselves prepared for the things to come.
That seems to be a consistent theme across all three presentations. Check in with your regulators early and often if you want to bring a product to market. Jamie, my next question is for you. How does FSIS coordinate with Singapore and other countries on issues like this?
Yeah, so FSIS has not coordinated with Singapore that I know of. And although FSIS does consider trade implications of its regulatory actions within the required economic analyses for rulemaking, it typically doesn't work with foreign governments when developing regulations. I know FSIS, together with FDA, have met with foreign firms to discuss the technologies around developing the cell-cultured products. And I also know that we've all presented at numerous conferences similar to this. And we also FSIS works with Codex and other international food and public health organizations. But as far as I know, we haven't coordinated officially government to government with international partners or government agencies. I do want to point out, though, that FSIS and FDA recently provided this similar overview to officials in Brazil via the Good Food Institute Brazil.
We're grateful that you were able to do that. Thank you. Dipti, my next question is for you. Food lawyer to food lawyer, I'm not sure that any of us creating a regulatory system from scratch would bifurcate authority between USDA and FDA for the safe production of food. But that's what we've got in the United States. Do you think that this formal agreement that the two agencies have entered into will ensure that cultivated meat is safe and properly labeled when it comes to market?
So it is a great question, and food lawyers, myself included, get asked often about the movement to a one agency approach in our food system quite a lot. It's a bit of an evergreen issue. Of course, there is an urge to respond by saying that the current system is overlapping and confusing. And while that observation may, in fact, bear some truth, what comes next is the harder question, right? And that harder question is, what do you do about it? Our food system is based on a century of precedent and laws that took shape, as I mentioned, at the turn of the 20th century. And it was formally established into law in 1938 and then subsequently amended many times over. And the lines that have been drawn, they reflect that history, and they're set in our food laws and implementing regulations, which Jamie walked us through. And those have taken years, if not decades, to establish and implement. So rewriting that history and body of law and completely reorganizing regulatory agencies is no small feat. And so what has been the case for nearly all new technology and emerging technologies in the last 30 years has been that the agencies have analyzed and interpreted their current law to apply to new technology. And that is exactly what the formal agreement does. So it outlines a framework to ensure that products are safely and properly labeled prior to and during commercialization. And that framework is based on long-standing law and policy. The pre-market assessment thus far has been, to my knowledge, incredibly rigorous, and labeling will be subject to the same requirements as conventional products, including pre-approval, as we've talked about today. So, for those reasons, the framework really does provide extensive oversight throughout the production process to assure products that are safely and appropriately labeled. I know there are open questions about labeling, and the agencies are working through that issue. And I just want to echo something we said earlier, and that it is critical that stakeholders participate in these comment processes, particularly with the information that they can share with agencies pertaining to products and product characteristics, which is what should play a role in determining labeling. So long answer to your question, Jessica, but I could not help myself.
Well, that's a very comprehensive answer and appreciate it. And I think the labeling issue is such an interesting one, and it's certainly a topic that has captured the public's imagination when it comes to cultivated meat. How should we label these products on the shelf? Jamie, you mentioned that the agency has put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in ANPR, and will be determining kind of how the requirements for those labels. But in the interim, FSIS has asked companies to submit labels for USDA approval. Can you give us a sense of what USDA might be looking for with those submissions?
Yeah. So not to, I'm going to reiterate and sound repetitive, but I do want to just say under our acts, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and Poultry Products Inspection Act, FSIS must review and approve all cell cultured product labels, including those used on exported products, before they may be used in commerce. And we do not anticipate that our rulemaking process to establish these labeling requirements for cell cultured products will be complete before firms in the United States start applying for grants of inspection and start submitting labels to FSIS for review. So in the interim, before the labeling regulations are made final, and as explained just in the general labeling requirements, which apply to meat and poultry products, among other things, the labeling must be truthful, it must be accurate, not misleading. FSIS doesn't have specific requirements for most types of meat and poultry products, so only the general labeling requirements will likely apply. So the review of cell cultured product labels before specific regulatory requirements are established should not be problematic. Mm-hmm. But once the labeling regulations are finalized, labels approved prior to rulemaking will likely, maybe not, have to be modified to comply with the new labeling requirements, and once they're implemented, and thus subject to reapproval.
Thank you. I realize we are over our time, but this is such a fascinating topic. I want to get one last question in really quickly. Taehyung, do you have a sense of which countries might follow in Singapore's footsteps in approving a cultivated meat product?
Right. So we have been having some early talks with some of our fellow regulators. For example, those in Food Standards Australia, New Zealand, Health Canada, the UK FSA. We haven't had a chance to really talk much with the US though, although I do hear from many of the companies that they are quite positive on the US market. So that may be a hint. I have no idea really.
Okay. And Dipti, any speculation?
Oh, I'm going to let Taehyung speculate for the rest of us.
All right. Well, I would love to be talking with you all for the rest of the day, but there are some more sessions for the Good Food Conference, including one coming up on how alternative seafood can fit into oceans policy. So we have to go now. Thank you all for your insights. This has been an incredibly informative panel, and we're just so honored to have both the U.S. government and the government of Singapore represented here today, as well as a private sector insights from Dipti. So thank you all, and thanks to our audience for joining us and for asking so many interesting questions in the chat. Goodbye.